10 years ago born the guerrilla in El Salvador, and the situation for the guerrilla was so very bad in respect to the government, because they start to burn. And through this 10 years, the guerrilla, the popular movement in El Salvador is getting strong every year. And now the situation is different because we have all the people, they are with us. They don't want anymore this military government, and they are decided to fight to win the revolution and to make a socialist here in El Salvador. And I think we are in the last stage of the process, because we are waiting to give the last bottle who are going to decide the scene in El Salvador. Well, I can say when we are going to take the power, because that is impossible, but I can say that we are in the last months of the fight, and I think about 3 or 4 months we are giving the last bottle, the main bottle, which are going to put out the government and which are going to change the situation in El Salvador.
Okay. I'm wondering, Mr. Ambassador, if you could just start with, recently you stated that you felt Salvador had reached a turning point. If you could expand on that.
Sure. Well, 6-7 months ago, the left could put 200,000 people into the streets of San Salvador. Today, they can't put 2,000 people into the streets. The reason for this is basically the agrarian reform and the other reforms that this government has passed and put into action. Now, when the left realized they could no longer get mass demonstrations out into the streets, they tried another tactic, which was a general strike. The first general strike had a partial success because people anywhere in the world are always willing to take a holiday. But the second general strike, the big general strike that they called, was a total failure. So they now have lost the capacity to keep people home from work. They don't dare to call another general strike because it will fail again. So as they no longer can count on the tactic of mass movements or on the tactic of general strike, they're reduced by the logic of their own internal capabilities to making attacks against burning buses, pulling bus drivers off of the buses and shooting them, putting bombs in public buildings, and finally hurling rockets against the American embassy. And this is a new stage because the far left has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and hundreds of man-hours trying to persuade the Congress and trying to persuade groups in the United States that this is basically a revolution of democratic, freedom-loving elements. And now it's become increasingly clear, and I would say totally clear now, that what we're coping with is a group of dedicated Marxist-Leninists that are going to try to take power by force, and that is their objective. They have no program that's different from the government that's in power. The basic reform that everyone has agreed on has been put into practice, and so this is why I say we're in a new stage.
Now, the U.S. has committed some $25 million, I believe, this year to the agrarian reform program in this country. Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who's a close advisor to Governor Reagan, has condemned the reform as too radical, has proposed in Congress that there be a funding cutoff. And what would you think the effects would be if the U.S., either the Congress or the next administration, were to cut off U.S. aid to the reform?
Well, it would be a very serious setback, because the United States has had a policy, it's been established policy in the United States to favor land reform, where conditions justify land reform. And clearly, if any country ever cried out for land reform, it was El Salvador, where a tiny percentage of the people owned the majority of the land. Now, I suppose that I don't expect that the United States Congress will cut off those funds. I think that Senator Helms has a very special view of the world, and I don't think that the majority of the Congress agree with his special view of the world, and therefore I expect stated U.S. policy to continue of support for this land reform, regardless of who is elected.
Do you have any specific indications how policy towards El Salvador would change under a Reagan administration?
No, I do not have any such indications.
Okay. One thing that the U.S. has repeatedly stated is that the ruling military Christian Democratic junta here is essentially centrist, and yet recently a number of Salvadorian observers, including some of the leadership of the agrarian reform, have said that the claim that the junta is veering sharply to the right. They specifically point to the militarization decree of August 22nd and to the recent stripping of power of Colonel Adolfo Majano, considered the most liberal junta member. What's your reaction to that, specifically to the whole Majano affair?
Well, I really don't think that the Majano thing is really very important, honestly. I think that you have a five-man junta is an unnatural animal, and it would be surprising if there weren't stresses and strains. And the idea that Colonel Majano is more liberal than Colonel Gutierrez is really a perception that a great many observers do not share, and in my conversations with both of those men, they don't share. They don't believe that there's any philosophical differences between them either. But I do think that there's an important point to be made about why some people perceive this government to be moving to the right. I don't think this government's moving to the right at all. I think what happened is that the private enterprise sector, 90% of it, which probably is either on the center or on the moderate right, is distinguished by its pragmatism. And they have looked around and assessed the situation and found that indeed this junta, this government, is the only real possibility they have of making this society work, or the program of this government, and they're willing to support that program. And this is what distinguishes the free enterprise sector, or the moderate right, from the left. The the free enterprise sector is pragmatic and willing to work, and they'll take their losses and figure out how to move forward and save the country. Meanwhile, unfortunately, respectable members of the left are adopting the role of apologists for terrorists, and I think that's an unwelcome role for them, and I hope that they come to their senses and abandon that role. Adopting the role of apologists for terrorists, and I think that's an unwelcome role for them, and I hope that they come to their senses and abandon that role.
Now, aside from some $60 million in reform aid, the U.S. also has a small military aid program of $5.6 million. What I'm wondering, I think what a lot of people are wondering, is should this government come under increased pressure from the guerrillas, how far would the U.S. be willing to go in terms of additional aid? Would we, for instance, guarantee an open pipeline for ammunition resupply, for weapons? Would we be willing to bring in ground advisors or military personnel?
The basic issue regarding support of this government and military assistance for this government is who's in charge. You have a new government, a fledgling government, that's trying to get control of the country with the guerrillas of the left, being the obstacle to that. And then you have the other problem of rightist guerrillas, rightist hit squads, which kill indiscriminately mostly young people who are suspected of participating in leftist activities. In some of those reprehensible activities, we know that some security forces participate. We're convinced that the government is gradually getting control over the military, and that the military is gradually putting in a chain of command and moving these elements that do not accept discipline out, but they haven't succeeded yet. And until they do get a handle on these security forces and put an end to the human rights abuses, I suppose that the block on any important military assistance will remain. As soon as we can see clearly that the military have put an end to their relationship with the extreme violent right and have reassessed their role and have decided to support a political process leading toward elections and civilian government, then I think the way will be open for important military assistance, because we don't want to see a Marxist-Leninist movement take over in this country.
Now, in the event that this government were to come under intense pressure, could you see the possibility of either U.S. ground forces or U.S. advisors entering directly in the conflict?
No. I mean, I would be very much against that. And I cannot imagine any situation that would come up in what I would call the short-term future. In other words, this is a very fast-breaking situation, and I'm not trying to predict 6 months or a year ahead. But as far as I see the situation developing now, there are no circumstances under which I would recommend such a military presence here. And I think that the left is weakening and not strengthening. I believe that the the Salvadoran military really can be very proud of themselves in this sense, that they have taken on an important guerrilla movement and they are defeating it, and they've had practically no assistance from outside, whereas the guerrillas themselves live on outside assistance. Those rockets that came through the walls of this embassy where you're sitting now were manufactured outside of El Salvador and imported into El Salvador. So it's the extreme left that's importing lethal weapons and not the Salvadoran military.
Well, where do you think these weapons are coming from, or is there any indication where, factual indication?
I think that the extreme left, through kidnappings and other methods, have raised important amounts of money and buy these arms on the open market. I think that's basically how they get them.
So it's primarily a black market operation as opposed to, say, any indication of direct arms aid from Cuba or Nicaragua?
From Nicaragua, there is no evidence at all, which I'm aware of, any of the Nicaraguan government collaborating with the guerrillas. There certainly is evidence that Castro has been collaborating with the guerrilla movement in the sense that he's trained people and undoubtedly has sent them some arms. But at this point, at least, with the exception of these RPGs, as far as we can tell, the Salvadoran military are better armed than the guerrillas.
1 minute, please. And I'm wondering how much really you see the effect of Castro and Cuba on events here in Central America as outside forces acting on movements here, and how much their origins are in the social conditions and inequality with
I think we should be. There is a Castro connection. There are. These movements receive moral support, propaganda support, training support, and probably some arms from Castro. But my problem with the Castro connection is that it leads people to believe that if Castro didn't exist, that everything would be fine here. And that is just not true. We would be having a revolutionary situation in El Salvador whether Castro existed or not. And you can only deprive people of their legitimate rights for so long a period. You can only take the profits of the totality of the country and only devote those profits to the benefit of a few for so many years before it catches up with you. And once it catches up with you, you've got a revolution on your hands. Now, the importance of what is happening in El Salvador is there is a revolution going on against special privilege, against the rigging of the political system. But it's a non-Marxist revolution. It's a revolution that specifically includes a substantial and even a predominant role for free enterprise, and it's not anti-American. Up until now, the model for revolution in Latin America has been communist, Castro, pro-Russian, anti-American. Now what we're undergoing here is a revolution that is far more profound than the revolution in Nicaragua. The land reform here is 100 times more far-reaching than any land reform attempted in Nicaragua. But it's earned the enmity of important powers in the world because it's non-communist, because it's pro-free enterprise, and because it's not anti-American, and because we support it.
There's another connection that probably Americans don't think of too much. You might call a Begin connection, which is that Israel has now become a major arms supplier in the area after the U.S. cut off military aid to Guatemala and to the Somoza regime in Nicaragua in '77 for human rights abuses. Israel became major arms suppliers to those countries and is today also a major supplier to the Salvadorian Air Force. Wondering what you think of the overall effect of Israeli arms sales in this region.
Well, I think that any country that supplies arms without making a very careful political judgment regarding to what use those arms are going to be put is making a grave error. And Israel has cost itself a lot of important support by its supplying of arms to the Somoza government. And I think, I personally believe it's an error. But, that's Israel's decision to make. I work for the American government, and Israel has its own role to play, but that's my opinion.
Also, it seems almost at this stage, almost any conflict within any single government in Central America is going to connect up with the surrounding countries and governments. Specifically here, some of the military leadership in Guatemala has said that if they see the left taking power in Salvador, they would intervene militarily. At the same time, government leaders in Nicaragua said that if U.S. forces came into Salvador, they'd see that as an attack on themselves. What role do you see Salvador's neighbors, specifically Guatemala and Nicaragua, but also Honduras, playing on the conflict here?
Well, look, this trendy phrase, the domino theory, all that really means is political and social events in one country have an influence on political and social events in neighboring countries. Of course, that's undeniable. I think, and it's especially true in Central America, where you have 5 relatively weak and somewhat unstable regimes reinforcing each other in their weaknesses. And this is why it's so terribly important that our policies succeed in El Salvador. Because if our policies succeed in El Salvador, and if out of this powder keg that we're sitting on now can come out a profound, a country that's undergoing a profound social, political, and economic change towards a more egalitarian society, towards democracy and pluralism, then this will have an important effect on bringing Nicaragua towards a more pragmatic solution and less ideological solution to its problems. And it will also influence Guatemala, perhaps, to take a more moderate stand on change, on the need for change. There's no way that the extreme left can take over in El Salvador, in spite of what all the propaganda machines say. The only way that the extreme left can take power in El Salvador is if this government moves too far to the right. And if at that point, if this government moves too far to the right, you will see elements within the government leaving it. And those people will then become part of the opposition, and it will, that outlet or that the hemorrhaging out of this government, hypothetically, would give human and financial and other resources, spiritual resources in a sense, to the left, which would then resurge. But right now the left is moribund. It has no program. But if for example, if this government becomes too influenced, as you were suggesting earlier, by rightist elements, and they try to roll back, for example, the agrarian reform and not carry it through, then the eventuality I just described could take place.
Do you see rightist elements in this area? And when you talk about rightists in Central America, you're talking about large sums of money. Do you see them attempting to play any role in the elections, an election campaign going on in the United States?
Not really. I don't really know about that. I'm sure that it exists, but I have no evidence that it does. I know that extreme right elements, as well as extreme left elements, try to influence members of Congress whom they believe are sympathetic to their views. I don't think they've had very much success.
Do you, okay, given that it's essentially internal, what effect, there are specific things now that have been put in the Republican platform, including aid cut off to Nicaragua and a reopening of arms sales for Guatemala. How would those kind of changes in policy affect the situation? Okay, given that it's essentially internal, what effect, there are specific things now that have been put in the Republican platform, including aid cut off to Nicaragua and a reopening of arms sales for Guatemala. How would those kind of changes in policy affect the situation here, if at all?
Well, it's terribly important, in my view, that the United States support the private sector in Nicaragua, which is the purpose of the loan, to maintain a lively and prosperous and increasingly vital private sector in Nicaragua. And I think that can have a very important effect in moderating some of the ideological silliness. No, I don't want to say that. I'll take that out. In moderating some of the more extreme ideologues in Nicaragua. Regarding Guatemala, the situation in Guatemala is still unfolding, and there's very serious problems there. In a sense, El Salvador is far ahead of Guatemala in seeking a common sense, pragmatic solution to its problems, and I don't think that effort has really got underway yet.
Yeah, a lot of, I guess, members of the former oligarchy here have gone to Guatemala. I believe Robert Dabusan is now in Guatemala, and some of the ultra-right elements. Have you had any indications of a mercenary presence, a presence of outside forces in the area, in El Salvador? Or?
We have had a lot of reports of mercenaries or foreigners fighting with guerrillas of the left, but no one's ever found any proof that these people are really here. I think, though, it would be idle to suppose that there were not some Sandinistas who came over basically on their own. I don't believe that they're over here because the Nicaraguan government has sent them. But I believe that, being a revolutionary is a very romantic thing. And it's a lot more fun than working as long as you don't get killed. And so I'm confident that there are some Nicaraguans here, and for all I know, Cubans, but we don't have any hard evidence of it. Secondly, there's been a lot of talk by the far right, the feudal right, of Guatemala about training guerrillas on the border and bringing them into El Salvador. But as far as I can tell, it's mostly talk.
There's been no indications of Guatemalan army regulars in the border areas, anything like this?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Well, just the final thing, it's a very fluid situation here. 6 months ago, you said it appeared very likely there'd be a civil war developing in Salvador. Right now, your feeling is that the reform is effectively undermining the left's base of support. The right is not threatening to stage a coup or seize power. Can you project 6 months into the future?
Well, I can predict 6 months into the future only on the basis of, what I hope, what I believe, what I think. If we continue to act with tact and intelligence, if we continue to be supportive, if other countries begin to recognize what the true nature of the Marxist threat here, if a lot of good things fall into place, and if this government proves able to translate the loss of support of the left, for the left, into support for its programs and its political process, then I think the chances are excellent that 6 months from now we'll be able to say that El Salvador is out of danger. But there's an awful lot of things that can go wrong over the next 6 months.
Sorry, can we cut this off?
Thank you. Just entered the occupied headquarters of the Organization of American States. The River Sand Pool, where the bridge was bombed 2 days ago, is the alleged site of a massacre in May, massacre of several hundred peasants several miles upriver from the bridge. Massacre alleged by church witnesses, priests, and others in the area. Supposedly was the work of Salvadoran and Honduran armed forces during an attempt by large number of campesinos to evacuate their villages and cross over into Honduras. Life in the northern mountains of Chalatenango, which has always been difficult, always been hard, has in recent months become deadly. Duarte, a member of the junta visiting here in Chalatenango, the head of the department of Chalatenango. He and 2 other members of the 5-member ruling junta visiting here today, telling the people that if the left really wants to participate, they're welcome to give up violence and join the political process. Napoleon Duarte, well named for his speaking style. The 3 junta members, Duarte, Morales, Ehrlich, and Colonel Guterres, now walking through the streets of the city of Chalatenango with dozens of bodyguards and well-armed army and national police support. Hundreds of local townspeople following them to a free barbecue, sort of a political rubber chicken circuit they've been doing around the countryside in recent weeks to show that the country is in fact secure. Several dozen Cherokee jeeps full of bodyguards, escorted by national police on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, moving forward through the center of the crowd. So it's a campaign taking the government to the people to show that the government in fact can go to the people without being without being attacked, provided there's sufficient security.